The fog over the Baltic coast in October 1944 was so thick that it concealed the outlines of the horizon, blending the gray sky with the equally leaden waters. In the vicinity of the city of Memel, known today as Klaipeda, the vanguard units of the First Baltic Front, under the command of Army General Ivan Bagramyan, reached the sea surf. This event, which seemed like a triumphant conclusion to a large-scale offensive operation, was in fact only the beginning of one of the strangest and most contradictory chapters in the annals of global confrontation. At the moment when Soviet tanks halted at the water's edge, a huge grouping of German troops found itself cut off from the main forces of the Reich. 32 divisions, hundreds of thousands of armed men, thousands of guns and tanks suddenly became inhabitants of a gigantic island, pressed against the forests and swamps of the Courland Peninsula. In the headquarters, this was called the encirclement of Army Group __, quote, _0__. But in soldiers' folklore and memoirs, this place would forever remain the Courland Pocket, a territory where time seemed to have stopped while the rest of the world rapidly moved towards the finale of the great drama. To understand how this unique enclave came into being, it is necessary to go back to the events of the summer of 1944. Operation Bagration effectively destroyed Army Group Center, tearing a gap hundreds of kilometers wide in the German front. The Soviet command realized that a swift strike towards the Baltic would isolate the enemy's northern grouping, depriving it of land lines of communication with Prussia. By mid-October, the task was completed. German troops, located in Estonia and a significant part of Latvia, retreated to the peninsula, which in its shape resembles a fist raised over the Baltic Sea. From the north and west, they were washed by the waters of the Baltic, and from the east and south, they were pressed by a front stretching 200 kilometers from Libau to Tukums. The logic of military art suggested that such isolation should have led to a quick surrender or complete neutralization of the encircled forces. But reality proved to be much more complex. An area of about 15,000 square kilometers became a fortified region, which for the next 7 months would absorb the resources, forces, and hopes of both sides. The coastline of Courland became the only artery through which life flickered in this enormous grouping. The ports of Libau and Windau, now known as Liepaja and Ventspils, became key supply hubs. Daily, dozens of ships, escorted by destroyers and patrol boats, broke through Soviet minefields and air attacks, delivering ammunition, food, and fuel. This was a unique situation. The encircled army did not experience the acute deficit that proved fatal for the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. On the contrary, the presence of a powerful fleet and mastery of the sea in this sector allowed the German command to maintain the combat at a high level. Army Group North, later renamed Army Group Courland, consisted of the 16th and 18th Field Armies. These were experienced units that had gone through years of fighting near Leningrad and Pskov. They knew how to defend themselves in forested and swampy terrain, using every hill and every small river as a natural obstacle. The first layer of conflict was purely strategic and military. For the Soviet leadership, the existence of such a powerful enemy fist in the rear of the armies advancing on Berlin was an unacceptable risk. The command feared that German divisions, possessing vast experience and heavy weaponry, could launch a relief attack or be transferred by sea to strengthen the defense of the German capital. It was for this reason that colossal forces from the Second and First Baltic fronts were thrown into eliminating the pocket. From October 1944 to March 1945, 6 full-scale offensive operations were undertaken. Each of these battles was accompanied by massive artillery preparation and the involvement of hundreds of armored vehicles. However, Courland's geography played into the hands of the defenders. Dense forests, viscous swamps, and a limited number of roads turned any offensive into an exhausting advance along narrow corridors, where every meter of land was pre-ranged by enemy artillery. The First Battle of Courland began in the 20th of October, 1944. Soviet troops tried to break through the defenses on the fly and capture Libau to deprive the enemy of its main port. The battles were fought with a ferocity that neither side expected. The fields near Priakul became the site of mass tank deployment. Soviet T-3480s clashed with German "0" and "1" of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion dug into the ground. Despite numerical superiority in aviation and artillery, the advance of Soviet units was measured only in hundreds of meters per day. Mud and slush made maneuver virtually impossible, turning the war into a bloody grinding of resources. When the front stabilized by mid-November, it became clear that there would be no quick victory. The second battle, which unfolded in November, was an attempt to encircle German troops within the peninsula itself. The main blow was delivered in the direction of Saldus, which became the strategic hub of the entire pocket's defense. This small town, known for its peaceful landscapes, was turned into ruins. Here, Soviet assault groups used tactics honed in urban combat, the use of flamethrowers and sapper units to eliminate concrete fortifications. But each time, the German command managed to transfer reserves via internal communications, patching holes in the defense. During this period, it became evident that German artillery in Courland possessed phenomenal accuracy and density of fire, as all possible avenues of attack had been studied and pre-ranged by them over months of preparation. A special place in the history of this confrontation is occupied by the Third Battle, known as the Christmas Battle of December 1944. While in the Ardennes, German troops made their last attempt at a counteroffensive in the west, here, in the forests of Latvia, a cannonade thundered, not ceasing even on holiday nights. The Soviet command hoped to use the element of surprise, striking in severe frosts when the swamps were frozen over. But the cold became a common enemy. Soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite, and equipment refused to start. Nevertheless, the intensity of the fighting reached its climax. In the Juxta area, some of the bloodiest clashes occurred, where entire regiments lost combat capability in a few hours of active operations. The result remained the same. The front line barely moved, and losses on both sides numbered in the tens of thousands of people, whose life's journey ended in the snow-covered forests. From the German side, the situation looked no less paradoxical. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, who held the post of Chief of the General Staff of the Army, repeatedly demanded from Hitler the immediate evacuation of troops from Courland. He pointed out that 30 divisions were critically needed on the Oder and in Pomerania, where the fate of the Reich itself was being decided. But Hitler remained adamant. His logic was based on the conviction that the Courland fortress was a necessary springboard for a future counteroffensive, which was supposed to turn the tide of events. In addition, maintaining control over this region allowed the German fleet to continue training submarine crews in the eastern Baltic Sea, which was considered the last chance for success in the battle for ocean communications. As a result, hundreds of thousands of soldiers became hostages of this strategic illusion, holding a perimeter that daily lost more and more meaning in the context of the general collapse of the fronts. Hitler called Courland an aircraft carrier in the Baltic Sea, unwilling to admit that this aircraft carrier had long been aground and unable to take off. The second layer of this confrontation is hidden in the personal dramas and choices of people who found themselves within this perimeter. The commander of Army Group North, and later Courland, General Ferdinand Schörner, was known as one of the toughest and most ideologically devoted military leaders. His methods of maintaining discipline bordered on extreme cruelty, including public executions for the slightest sign of indecision or retreat without orders. This created an atmosphere of fanatical perseverance even in conditions of obvious hopelessness. On the other hand, soldiers and officers in the pocket quickly realized the specifics of their situation. Unlike other sectors of the front, there was no total hunger here. The fields of Courland were rich in harvest, and sea supplies worked surprisingly effectively. German units received not only ammunition, but also awards, leave, and even fresh newspapers from Germany. This created an illusion of normality amidst the chaos. A phenomenon arose that historians would later call a camp of armed prisoners of war. Soldiers understood that they were trapped, but as long as they held their positions, they were relatively safe from the horrors of retreating along broken German roads under Soviet airstrikes. Within the Soviet units assaulting Courland, the mood was different. After the liberation of Belarus and Lithuania, the soldiers felt the end was near. Attacking fortified enemy positions in the swamps, knowing that the main events were taking place on the way to Berlin, was psychologically difficult. Many mid-level commanders understood that frontal assaults on the Courland castle led to huge losses that were difficult to justify with tactical success. Advancing 3 or 5 kilometers in a week of fighting at the cost of thousands of comrades' lives caused muffled discontent. Every soldier realized that the end was near, and to end their life in the forests of Latvia a few weeks before the overall victory seemed the greatest injustice. Nevertheless, orders continued to come, and the infantry repeatedly went on the attack. In the memoirs of veterans, the idea often sounds that Courland was a forgotten front, where blood was shed that was rarely written about in central newspapers. The particular bitterness of this situation was compounded by the fact that in the Courland Pocket, not only representatives of different states fought against each other, but also people speaking the same language. The 131st Latvian Rifle Corps operated as part of the Soviet forces, while on the other side of the front was the 19th Latvian Grenadier Division. This was a tragedy within a tragedy, when compatriots, and sometimes even members of the same families, found themselves on opposite sides of the barbed wire. The personal motives of the participants in these battles were often far from official ideology. For some, it was a struggle for the liberation of their land from invaders. For others, an attempt to defend what they considered their independence, even under the patronage of a collapsing Reich. This internal conflict made the battles in Courland particularly fierce and irreconcilable, stripping them of even a shadow of chivalry. There are known cases when, during lulls, soldiers of Latvian units from both sides tried to shout across the front line, inquiring about the fate of relatives, but as soon as an attack began, they eliminated each other with renewed ferocity. The 4th and 5th battles, which took place in January and February of 1945, became a test of endurance. By this time, Soviet troops had already reached the Oder, and the fate of Berlin was sealed. However, orders from Moscow demanded continued pressure on the Courland grouping. At this time, Soviet aviation began to apply the tactic of air blockade, attempting to completely cut off sea communications. The ports of Libau and Windau were subjected to massive bombardments day and night. Yak 9 and La 7 fighters conducted continuous hunting for German Junkers 52 transport planes. Despite this, the German fleet showed miracles of organization. Admiral Karl Dönitz considered the retention of Courland a matter of honor for the naval forces. Kriegsmarine ships, including the heavy cruisers Admiral Scheer and Prince Eugen, periodically approached the coast and supported ground troops with fire from their main calibers. These enormous 280mm shells caused terrible destruction to the advancing Soviet units, further slowing their progress. The third layer of the conflict delves into the realm of ideas and philosophical understanding of what was happening. The Courland Pocket became a symbol of the inertia of a huge military machine that continues to move even when the purpose of that movement has been lost. It was a clash of two systems for which human resources were merely a tool in achieving global goals. On the part of the Reich, it was a manifestation of the fortress doctrine, turning cities and regions into sacrificial altars for the sake of a mythical gain of time. Hitler believed that every unit tying down enemy forces on the periphery contributed to saving the center. On the part of the Soviet leadership, it was the implementation of the principle of inevitable and complete elimination of any hotbed of resistance, regardless of the cost. A paradox arises. Courland practically did not affect the fall of Berlin. Its surrender would not have accelerated the denouement by more than a few days. Yet both sides continued to invest thousands of lives in this confrontation. It was a dispute about prestige and symbolism, where the map of the terrain became more important than the people moving across it. The philosophical essence of the Courland cauldron lay in its isolation, not only geographical but also ideational. Within its perimeter, a distinct micro-universe emerged with its own laws. Wehrmacht soldiers, cut off from families already living in the Soviet or Allied occupation zones, found solace in the performance of their military duty, taken to an absurd extreme. They defended a piece of Latvian land as if it were the gateway to their own homes in Bavaria or Saxony. On the Soviet side, young conscripts from 1944, who had not witnessed the war's beginning, burned with a desire to distinguish themselves and contribute to victory, sometimes displaying unjustified heroism in situations that required only patience and endurance. The clash of these two states of mind generated an endless chain of tragedies at the local level. The situation began to change drastically in March 1945, during the sixth and final major battle. When it became clear that Germany was in its death throes, the Soviet command decided to launch a decisive assault to finish with Courland once and for all. On a narrow sector of the front, artillery power was concentrated, surpassing all previous operations. The density of guns reached 200 units per kilometer of front. For several hours, the earth trembled from continuous explosions. It seemed that after such preparation, nothing living could offer resistance. But German troops, using deep bunkers and an extensive network of trenches, were again able to hold on. The losses of Soviet troops in the March battles were so great that the offensive impetus finally dried up. Marshal Leonid Govorov, commander of the Second Baltic Front, known for his rational approach, proposed changing strategy, switching to a strict blockade and awaiting the natural denouement of events in Berlin. This was an acknowledgement that military force had reached a dead end under these circumstances. A surprising turn occurred in April 1945. While the world watched the assault on the German capital, a strange, almost surreal calm settled over Courland. Active hostilities virtually ceased. Soldiers from both sides could see each other through binoculars, hear the sounds of field kitchens, and even exchange short shouts during moments when officers were absent. The war here transformed into a positional waiting game. The German command at this time nevertheless began a clandestine evacuation of the most valuable specialists, equipment, and some elite units. As part of Operation Hannibal, thousands of wounded and civilian refugees were transported west from the ports of Libau and Windau. However, the main mass of troops, almost 200,000 men, remained in place. This was a voluntary refusal of rescue for the sake of fulfilling an order that no one could issue anymore in ruined Berlin. The culmination came in early May 1945. While the victory banner already flew over the Reichstag and acts of surrender were being signed in the suburbs of Berlin, gunshots continued to echo in the forests near Tukums and Saldus. Some German units, disbelieving reports of the capital's fall, continued to offer resistance. General Karl Hilpert, commander of Army Group Courland, received official notification of unconditional surrender only on May 7th. For many German officers, this was a psychological collapse. They had held the front for 7 months. They had not been defeated in open battle. Their divisions had maintained structure and command. But the supreme order was unambiguous. A process began that is difficult to describe simply as surrender. It was an organized, almost ceremonial transfer of a huge, intact army into the hands of the victor. On May 10, 1945, endless columns of men in gray uniforms stretched eastward. Thousands of trucks, carts, and foot units moved along the roads of Courland. Soldiers stacked their weapons in neat piles on the roadside. According to official data, 189,000 people surrendered, including 28 generals and over 5,000 officers. As trophies, Soviet troops acquired hundreds of serviceable tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and huge ammunition depots, enough for several more months of active defense. This was the largest simultaneous mass surrender in the entire concluding period of the war. Many of these men still could not comprehend that their months of stubborn resistance had ended not in a breakthrough or a heroic demise, but in a long journey to prisoner of war camps deep within the Soviet Union. When the dust from the columns settled, historians were faced with the full question: what exactly was the Courland Pocket? On the one hand, it was a successful strategic operation by Soviet troops to isolate a large enemy grouping. If these 30 divisions had been near Berlin in April 45, the battle for the city could have dragged on for many months, claiming even more lives. On the other hand, Courland became a symbol of strategic deadlock. Soviet troops suffered about 160,000 irreparable losses in these battles, and the total number of those put out of action by injury exceeded 500,000. German losses also numbered in the tens of thousands. Was the blocking of these divisions worth such a price if the outcome of the entire war was being decided elsewhere? Historians still fiercely debate whether it was a command error to send infantry into frontal assaults on the Courland fortress when it could have simply been blocked with minimal forces, awaiting the inevitable end. The resonance of these events is felt even today, decades later. The Courland Pocket serves as a powerful reminder that in the history of any great war, there are such forgotten areas where the scale of the tragedy is hidden behind the dry lines of reports. The lessons of those events tell us about the importance of critical thinking even in conditions of rigid hierarchy. The Courland experience is analyzed by military specialists as an example of creating an autonomous defensive system capable of functioning in complete isolation. But behind the technical details and strategic schemes, there is always a human being. The universal truth is that no political expediency or ambitions of leaders can fully justify turning living people into hostages of circumstances, forced to give their lives for goals that have lost their meaning. The Courland forests became a huge graveyard of ideas, where fanatical persistence collided with the inevitable force of progress. Today, numerous memorials and mass graves can be found in the former pocket. They stand in silence, broken only by the rustling of pines and the cries of seagulls. These are places of pilgrimage for the descendants of those who fought here on both sides. Here, one understands that history does not have unambiguous colors. The tragedy of the Latvian people, split into two warring factions, remains an open wound. The Courland Pocket became a microcosm of the entire Great War, where grandeur and baseness, heroism and senseless cruelty intertwined in an inextricable knot. The significance of this episode for the present lies in realizing how easily a vast region can be turned into a locked cage if the value of each individual human life is forgotten in favor of global plans. Returning to that foggy morning on the Baltic coast, where our narrative began, we see the same scene, but imbued with deep meaning. The sea, which once was the sole hope for the encircled, now calmly rolls its waves onto the same sandy beaches near Klaipėda. The forests of Kurzeme still bear traces of those events. Overgrown trenches, craters turned into small ponds, and pieces of rusty steel deeply embedded in the bark of trees. Those events became a cycle that closed in on itself. Beginning as a swift breakthrough to the sea, they concluded with an organized surrender of weapons in the forest. The history of the Courland Pocket is not just a chronicle of a siege. It is a grand reflection on the meaning of human endeavor. The final thought that remains with us is that the most difficult victory is the one that allowed reason and compassion to be preserved in conditions of absolute hopelessness. Courland will forever remain in memory as a place where time stood still for 7 months, creating a unique and terrible social experiment in the open air. It was a camp of armed prisoners of war who continued to play at war when the world had already begun to build a new, peaceful life. We look at these photographs, gray columns, mountains of rifles, the tired eyes of people in tattered greatcoats, and realize that the history of Courland is a lesson on the importance of knowing when to stop. The emptiness left by those whose lives ended in these swamps is now filled with silence, but their memory continues to resonate in every surge of the Baltic wind. This is a finale that itself became the beginning of a long and difficult path to realizing that peace is not just the absence of war, but an active unwillingness to turn the earth into another fortress or pocket. 7 months of confrontation in Courland became an eternal reminder that even in the darkest forest of history, one must seek a way out leading to light, and not deeper into meaningless darkness.